I've got a question for you. Can Daniel King ever make a decent video? Not just competently produced, which I think we all know he's got a real problem with, but coherently thought out. I wouldn't be betting on that, but let's take a look and see. This is what happens when you care more about your feelings than you do about the objective facts, and that's going to be a problem again today. I trust nobody is surprised. So let's get to it. Welcome back to yet another episode of Daniel King Makes a Complete Fool of Himself on the Internet. This time, he brings up the ontological argument, which is good because he might have some better luck there than with all the scientific failures that he's done in the last couple of videos. However, I wouldn't really be expecting much because this is Daniel King we're talking about, one of the most pointless apologists maybe ever. And that's not to say that any of the rest are any better per se, but at least they can usually string a coherent sentence together, something that Danny Boy seems to have a serious problem with. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started on part one of this two-part monstrosity, and don't say I didn't warn you.
What is the ontological proof God is real?
And we'll get to that after Danny struts his stuff, or, more properly, just waddles around for a bit. However, I don't think anyone is going to be impressed, as this is just one more of those things that goes back to Anselm, and it doesn't actually get them anywhere. I am not really sure how King could turn this into such a long video, but I guess we'll see over the next two entries. So strap in, boys and girls, because this is going to get rough.
This is the evidence from abstract reasoning. It goes like this. Premise A, God has all perfection.
Says who? Because that's just a claim. You haven't proven that God exists yet, nor how you've come to any of those conclusions rationally. This is just assuming the conclusion in the middle of your argument. This is why all of these ridiculous philosophical arguments fall apart so easily. They just assume things that are absolutely not in evidence. But it gets even worse, so let's continue.
Premise B, existence is a perfection.
Even Christians don't agree with that. This is a fallen world, remember? It should only take a few seconds of thinking about it to blow this one completely out of the water. King kind of has a problem thinking, so I guess it's understandable why he couldn't get that. Obviously, existence isn't perfect. It's not even close. Nothing about existence is even arguably perfect. It just is what it is, and we have to make the best of it. Therefore, argument lost. Both premises are complete bullshit. But let's get on to his conclusion before we really start to laugh.
Conclusion, therefore, God exists.
Yeah, no. This is one that's so painfully, obviously dumb that I'm even surprised that King even bothered with it. But this is all just one more on the list that he found on a creationist website somewhere that he just mindlessly added to his video series, so I guess we really can't be surprised. I mean, we're only 32 seconds into his video. What can he possibly do to get him to almost 12 minutes? I don't know. I guess we're just going to have to see.
Ontology refers to the area of metaphysics that tries to answer the question of what exists. This kind of philosophical discipline relies largely on abstract reasoning to arrive at its conclusions. Abstract reasoning meaning that if all you could do was think, how could you prove that something exists?
You couldn't. This is one of those places that philosophy just goes completely off the rails, and the religious make use of it because, well, they just want to believe. The simple fact is, you can't prove that anything exists, period, because you cannot solve the problem of hard solipsism. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It matters what you can actually do in the real world, and whether anybody likes it or not, you can't really prove that there is a real world in the first place. It doesn't work that way. It's something that we all just have to agree to based on individual experiences and the necessity that we have to start somewhere. Of course, the religious, they just don't like that very much, do they? This is all about their faith and their fifis after all. They are, unfortunately, not alone. Now, this has nothing at all to do with the ontological argument. It's just an example that came up just a few minutes ago as I was writing this. But someone was arguing that Islam was wrong because the Quran allows all kinds of things that he personally didn't like. And that happens all the time these days. You will see that one a lot. What I think is right and wrong is objectively right and wrong because I think so. Yeah, not so much. I had to go and remind them that these books are a product of their time. At the time that the Quran was being written, pedophilia, sexual slavery, and, well, real slavery, those were all perfectly acceptable in the culture that Islam started in. Now, I'm not going to argue that that makes it okay because okay isn't even a thing. What you think today isn't true because there is no true. There is only currently functional. Our modern views, in the United States at least, is that those things just aren't acceptable. Yet, if you go to modern-day Iraq or Iran or Saudi Arabia, places like that, you can find plenty of people who still exercise all of those things in accordance with the law. Child marriage is still a thing throughout the Middle East and Asia. So you can sit there and say, well, they're wrong. And they can sit there and say, well, you're wrong. And nothing ever gets accomplished because there is no such thing as objective right and wrong. It's all just opinion wrapped up in a cultural bow. It's why people need to be able to step back from their own cultural preconceptions and start looking at reality. And sadly, most people in the modern world, most people throughout history, they've simply not been capable. So let's continue.
The famous statement by the French philosopher and scientist René Descartes, "I think, therefore I am," is an example of ontological reasoning.
Which, as I've pointed out before, just doesn't hold true. There are lots of other options beyond you're automatically real because you think that you have a thought. Well, yeah, okay. Now, yes, this is going to go into, well, what do you mean by is territory? But this is making a truth claim that simply cannot be validated. You have to remember that Descartes lived in a time where a lot of modern ideas just didn't exist. The entire concept of computers, for instance, was entirely foreign to him. I doubt he could have even imagined what it would mean to talk about artificial intelligence. Therefore, let's just take AI for an example. Let's say you take a computer program, a really super advanced computer program, something that even modern people would have a hard time imagining being real. Before you say, well, that could never happen, let me remind you that just 5 years ago, people didn't think AI could exist. Even though right now it's still in its very early stages, it's still there. 50 years ago, people couldn't have possibly imagined photorealistic CGI that was virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. In another 10 or 15 years, who knows where we might be? That can't happen only applies to right this instant. You can't speak for what might happen in the future. So what happens if we get this super intelligent AI that's been programmed with incredibly complex algorithms to think that it's actually thinking? Inside the computer, there would be no way at all to distinguish between actual thought and being programmed to appear to be thinking. Now, ask that AI if it exists as an independent, intelligent agent. Is it? Or is it just following that programming that we've put in place? These are thought experiments that don't actually get you anywhere demonstrably real. Most of it is just feel-good nonsense. And that's a lot of what philosophy is.
Apologists have used ontological reasoning to prove the existence of God.
No, they haven't. They have used wishful thinking and theologically friendly nonsense to get to the conclusion that they were emotionally predisposed to reach all along. It fails, just like his example at the very beginning of this video failed, because they are starting with the conclusion already firmly entrenched and then circling around and around and saying, see, we were right all along. That's just not how any of this works.
Anselm, who lived from 1033 to 1009 AD, was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
All right. I know that I keep pointing this out. I mean, I have to, several times a video at least, but he can't possibly be this dumb. He can't have watched this video before he posted it, and hopefully he at least did that, and not noticed what he just said. So let's go back and repeat it and see if we can figure out what's going wrong.
Anselm, who lived from 1033 to 1009 AD, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anselm, who lived from 1033 to 1009 AD, was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I mean, he doesn't know how dates work, does he? Anselm died in 1109, not before he was born. And you might say, well, it was just a mistake. He misspoke. Yes, but he misspeaks a lot. Not only does he have a real problem putting words in the right order, but he gets the very simple facts wrong in just about every single video. We are supposed to think that this guy is a credible authority on something, I don't know what. It's just that he's not. We're supposed to think he has the slightest clue what the hell he's talking about. And this is why all of the videos that I do on him, we can't even take them serious anymore. Mostly it's just pointing out just how dumb Danny Boy is, because he's really not any less credible than apologists like William Lane Craig. Craig might be able to get his words out most of the time in roughly the right order, but his arguments are really no better. Remember, this is all about lowering the bar. So if we've stopped laughing, which I don't know, I don't think I've really stopped laughing this entire video yet, but let's keep going because I'm sure there's going to be a lot more dumber crap going on from here on out.
He was the first to articulate the ontological proof of God's existence. His book contains a prayer in which Anselm asked God to reveal his argument for his existence that would be convincing to the atheistic fool of Psalms 14:1.
And that's the best he can come up with? Maybe you should try doing some thinking instead of just talking to yourself and playing make-believe. That's really all that's going on here after all. Anselm, like King, was starting with the conclusion that he really wanted to reach and then just working backwards, creating arguments that fit in with his pre-existing beliefs and could get back around to where he was desperate to go in the first place. Because that's how religion works. They don't start with a blank slate and the evidence and try to work out how things actually go. It's why, as we already saw, they begin with God already exists, and here's what God is like. And then they try to pretend that their presuppositions somehow prove that their God is actually real. That is not an intelligent way to look at reality, but then again, Daniel King is not an intelligent man.
That prayer goes like this.
And we're going to skip through that, just like we do with most Bible verses, because none of it actually matters. Just because your book says a thing, that doesn't get you anywhere intelligent. What you want to believe means nothing. Therefore, we're going to do some fast forwarding until he comes out the other side. So, chipmunk time.
And so, Lord, do you, who to give understanding of faith, give me, so far as you know it to be possible, to understand that you are as we believe. In that, indeed, we believe that you are a being, than which nothing greater can be conceived. Or is there no such nature, since the fullness of his heart, there is no God? But at any rate, this very fool, when he hears this being, of which I speak, a being, than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears. And what he understands in his understanding, although he does not understand it to exist. For it is one thing for an object to be in understanding, and another to understand that the object exists. When a painter first conceives of what he will afterwards perform, he has it in his understanding, but he does not yet understand it to be, because he has not yet performed it. But after he has made the painting, he both has it in his understanding, and he understands that it exists because he has made it. Hence, even the fool demands that something exists in the understanding, at least, and that which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears this, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in understanding, and surely that, then which nothing greater can be conceived, cannot exist in understanding alone. For suppose it exists in understanding alone, it can conceive to exist in reality, which is greater. Therefore, if that, then which nothing greater can be conceived exists in understanding alone, the very being, then which nothing greater can be conceived, which is greater can be conceived. But obviously, this is impossible. Hence, there exists a being, then which nothing greater can be conceived, exists both in understanding and in reality. This prayer proposes that God must exist because he is the greatest being that can be conceived.
You know, I almost popped back in because Danny Boy screwed up reading his script pretty badly, but I managed to hold it together. If you want to see what he actually said, the link to the original video is down in the description. Anyway, just because you can imagine something, that doesn't make that thing real. Even in Anselm's time, people made fun of him for this. Gunilo suggested the existence of an island that was the most perfect island that can possibly be conceived. But that doesn't mean that island actually exists. You can't go there. You can't jump on a boat and sail across the seas until you reach this island. It's just a concept in your head, just like God is. Besides, I can imagine a deity that's a hell of a lot better than the Christian God. How about one that didn't create evil? How about one that wouldn't send anyone to eternal torment? I'll take one that's not being a dick. I'll take one that isn't at the top of the leaderboard in the world's longest game of hide and seek. There's a lot of ways to make God better, because the concept of better is entirely subjective. So this is just stupid. Let's move on.
As Anselm unfolds the ontological argument for God's existence in the later chapters of his book, he proposes that if a being exists in the mind, but not in reality, then a greater being could be imagined who would exist in both the mind and in reality.
But the whole idea of greater is pointless. Greater than what? Define your terms. This is just a giant theological dick-waving contest. According to the Muslims, Allah is greater than the Christian version of God. According to the Hindus, their gods are greater than any other that other religions have come up with. Just because you really want your God to be hot shit, that doesn't mean your God is real. And that's where this whole thing starts to break down. It doesn't matter what you want to believe. It only matters what is actually true. It's the truth that matters, not your childish fee-fees. But they can't get that through their heads, can they?
But God, by definition, is infinitely great. No one can surpass his greatness.
And where did you get that definition from? That's the problem. You don't have a real demonstrable God to point to and say, see, this is how we know what God is like. Because you can't just define your deity into existence because you really like the idea. Yet, that's really all they're doing, isn't it? You don't get to tell me what your God is like until you can show me how you've come to that conclusion rationally. I don't mean because it strokes your fee-fees or you read it in a book. I mean, show me how you've tested your ideas to see if they stand up to any measure of critical scrutiny. But I really want it to be true. That isn't a credible answer. It just makes you look dumb.
The Bible anticipates Anselm's proof in Psalms 95:3, where it reads, "For the Lord is the great God and the great King above all gods."
In other words, my book says a thing. Well, who cares what your book says? I mean, other than you. This is another case of reading things into your book that aren't actually there. Oh, the Bible foresaw what Anselm was going to say, instead of Anselm read the Bible and just came up with an idea. This is the kind of childish wishful thinking that the religious are guilty of. They are only trying to get back to their blind and wholly pathetic faith. They don't care about the truth at all.
Psalms 145:3 again speaks of the greatness of God. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. Since God is infinitely great, Anselm concludes he is great in every conceivable way, including in the reality of his existence.
And that's just dumb. Because all of this is just, I really like the book and the beliefs make me happy, so it's all just got to be true. Therefore, I'm going to assume that it's true, no evidence required, and interpret everything through that particular theological lens. Except that's not reality, is it? That's why you have to start with reality, which, granted, we can't actually prove is really there, but all of the evidence that we seem to have it at least suggests it, unlike all the empty claims about God. Just wanting a God to be real doesn't make that God real. Just feeling really, really good at the thought that your imaginary friend is out there doesn't stop it from being imaginary. This is why rationality and faith are entirely opposite. It's why people like Daniel King look so damn stupid.
Let me explain. As humans, we understand the concept of good.
Not universally. If we did, then we wouldn't have so many vastly differing ideas of morality or vastly differing laws around the world. Sharia law and the rules in the Bible should be exactly the same if any of this was the case. This is why the idea of objective morals is just so ludicrous, which, not really a spoiler, but Danny King's next video in the series goes into that. I'll leave the full explanation for when we get to that video, so gives you something to look forward to. But just as a teaser, all the evidence that we have shows clearly that objective morality is nonsense. It's why the religious have to make excuses for why it sure doesn't look like there is an objective morality. But humans are just sinners. Okay, what butthole did you yank that one out of? These are not things that are demonstrably true. It's why you go from evidence to conclusion, and the religious, and sadly a lot of other people as well, they go from conclusions to cherry-picking the evidence because they really, really, really want to believe. It just doesn't mean anything.
It is good for me to have a warm place to lay my head at night.
Well, that's what you find preferable, and to be fair, I do too. That's why you've decided to call it good, because you like it. However, your imaginary father figure in the sky, remember him? Isn't he supposed to be providing for mankind? Matthew 6:25-33. The passage that talks about God taking care of the birds and aren't you more valuable than they are? Verse 30 says, but if God so clothes the grass in the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O men of little faith? Great! So why are people hungry? Why are people homeless? Why is there poverty at all if this imaginary friend of yours is just going to magically take care of everyone? Well, sin, of course. It's an excuse that they made up to explain why their beliefs don't seem to be true. Well, God would take care of you if you just believed enough. In fact, it gets used to criticize other Christians because obviously, well, if they're not wealthy, if things aren't going really well for them, then God is repudiating their faith. This is literally the Christian version of playing holier than thou. It's one of the original forms of virtue signaling, and we all know how stupid that is. Daniel, feel free to fuck the hell right off, won't you?
It would be bad for me to be outside freezing in the cold. I can also imagine a greater good than having an indoor place to sleep. If I'm sleeping on a floor, I can imagine the greater good of sleeping on a mattress. As I'm sleeping in my house, I can imagine the greater good of sleeping in a beautiful palace.
But those things actually exist. You get to a point where you're not talking about reality anymore. Well, I can imagine sleeping on a cloud. I can imagine sleeping in a magical palace on a perfect planet in another galaxy. Except those things aren't real. At least you can't prove that they are. Once you reach the limits of what can be done in actual reality, everything else is just in your head. It's that these people can't tell the difference between reality and delusion, and that gets them into trouble. But I really want to go to heaven. Okay, so what? We have no reason at all to think that heaven is real. Grow the hell up.
For each good that I can imagine, I can always imagine still greater and greater degrees of goodness, even if I have never experienced them.
You notice he just explained what he's doing wrong. It's all in your imagination, Danny boy. It's not real. Just because you can imagine a thing, that doesn't mean that thing exists. Remember when I used to say that some of them just get so close to the truth, but they just can't take that final step? That's Daniel right now. I can imagine all kinds of things. I can imagine riding a unicorn. Yeah, but it had better be a really sturdy unicorn. Just saying. But that doesn't matter when unicorns aren't actually real. I can imagine a wonderful God. Fantastic. But since we have no reason to think that gods exist at all, that's all it is. Your imagination. It's in your head. He does not understand the difference between imagination and reality. And that's kind of a problem, wouldn't you think?
For instance, kindness is a form of goodness. If I am a good person, then I'm kind to those around me.
Then there are an awful lot of really evil Christians because Christianity has engaged in some really crappy stuff over the years. Everything from the Crusades and other religious wars to Catholic priests diddling little kids. So now my question becomes, does being a Christian make you kind, or can you be kind and not be a Christian at all? Because most of the people that I see that I personally identify as being kind, I don't really think they're very religious at all. Anyway, as you were saying, sir.
I've been kind on occasion, but I'm not as kind as I could be. Nevertheless, I can imagine a being who is perfectly kind.
And there goes your overactive imagination again. It doesn't matter what you can imagine. It matters only what is actually true. And this is kind of why Aquinas was dumb, no matter how much the religious, especially Christians, seem to value him. The religious are still doing the same stuff, using the same irrational, idiotic ideas that got them into so much trouble in the first place, because, as we all know, they just don't care about the truth. They just want to believe. All of this ontological garbage makes no sense to anyone who isn't starting from a religious bent. You can't get to fact from emotional fantasy, and that's all they're trying to do.
If the concept of good is extended in all areas to its furthest possible extent, we come to the concept of perfection. Anselm argues that if there is a being who is perfect in all ways of being, that being must exist because one of the qualities of perfection is actual existence.
And that's why, at least in my opinion, Anselm was an idiot. He's not alone, but he was an idiot. Because Anselm, just like Daniel King, just like William Lane Craig, just like a lot of people, he just wanted to believe. And he was looking for reasons that he could believe. Excuses for why the things that were in his head ought to be true outside. And that's not how that works. Anyway, we're going to stop here for the day because I figure too much King is hazardous to your mental health, but it's nice that he left us on a sort of interesting point. I get that a lot of religious people really value Anselm, just like they tend to value a lot of old dead thinkers, because religion hasn't really moved on that much since the 11th century. It's been talked about over and over and over again, but nobody has really handled the base problem that all of Anselm's 5 ways were just appeals to emotion and confirmation bias. If you don't approach them from a religious mindset, you don't go anywhere. And I've seen tons of people trying to defend Anselm, and every single one of them got hung up on that point. In fact, in one, I brought up the whole hot Canadian girlfriend thing. I've talked about that before, with the argument that it's better to have a real hot Canadian girlfriend than an imaginary one. Therefore, we must always assume that all hot Canadian girlfriends are real, even if they're not. Immediately, they balk at that because they aren't emotionally invested in it. This goes right back to them trying to define their gods into existence by arbitrarily attaching characteristics to them that you simply can't demonstrate. It's why, whenever you hear a theist say, well, by definition, God is X, You can completely dismiss that because they can't demonstrate that the definition means anything. They just really want it to be true. But wanting it to be true doesn't mean anything. Stop being dumb. So I guess we've got a week off before we see if Daniel tries all of this in the second half of his video. And I figure he will. But, what do I know, right? See you next week.